M83 have been a favourite band of mine since high school. Around year 11, I began dabbling in shoegaze music because it was my opinion I hadn't become pretentious enough and I needed to start pushing myself. That's only half a joke, by the way. To the best of my recollection, however, M83 was my gateway drug into the genre, so to speak. Starting with their more electronic dance number written for Jean-Michel Jarre's Electronica project, I fell in love with the project's use of massive synth walls and reverb-soaked guitars, a path that would lead me to the album I would call one of my top 5 favourites through the winter of 2016 and 17, Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts. This album is already quite an interesting beast in M83's discography, on account of its slightly rawer sound and moody atmosphere. But the reason I bring it up now is that, as of the release of this video, it is 20 years old, and 2 decades later, it is still a very important record, both in the evolution of M83 and the sound, and also as a record all on its own. In the winter of 2002, a year after the release of their self-titled debut, Anthony Gonzalez and Nicolas Fromageau would head into what they call M83 Studio to record this album. This was the first full-length project they committed to since the first album, though earlier that year they'd gone back to Echotone Studio to record a standalone track named Slowly, one that would find itself retroactively added to the tracklist of the self-titled debut album upon its re-release in 2005. As it would turn out, these sessions in the winter of 2002 would be the last time Gonzalez and Fromageau would record together for nearly 20 years. After a short tour promoting the release of Dead Cities, the latter would leave the project, going on to form his own band named Team Ghost. It's difficult to find any details on this split online, but it would seem it was an amicable one. As in 2018, Fromageau would temporarily rejoin M83 to work with Gonzalez on a film soundtrack for his brother Jan's film Un couteau dans le cœur, Knife and Heart in English. I don't know why I didn't just translate it. Whatever the case, Dead Cities would mark the last full studio album that Gonzalez and Fromageau would record together as M83, after which Gonzalez would largely strike out on his own with the project with a close circle of frequent collaborators like Morgan Kibbe, Kayla Sinclair, and his brother Jan. This makes the album pretty interesting in my mind, as while we can trace a direct line between this album and the sound that M83 would take on as it evolved along future albums, I often wonder what that sound might have ended up being had Fromageau stayed on the project. It's not a question we can ever really have an answer to, but it's one that pops into my head nonetheless. Sonically, M83 are reasonably upbeat. Their more recent work especially establishes a tone that seeks to inspire wonder and recall a childlike excitement, particularly on Hurry Up We're Dreaming and Fantasy. Even their first album largely leans into more chilled out emotions, only occasionally breaking out of that for an exciting dance track like Sitting, or a more melancholy moment like Slowly. Dead Cities, however, lies far outside the general tone of M83's work, striking a far darker atmosphere. There are upbeat moments on this album, such as the 2-act track of Cyborg and 0078H, but aside from that, cheer is hard to be found on this record. It largely ranges from the melancholic, such as on the beautifully arranged Run Into Flowers or the almost orchestral On a White Lake Near a Green Mountain, to tonal ambiguity, such as on the reverb-soaked shoegaze number Noise, to the positively foreboding, such as on Be Wild or the emotionally violent Gone. It's a tone I find myself describing as almost apocalyptic. When I fell in love with this album, the cover art, a photo named Snow Angels by Justin Kurland, struck me as somewhat haunting, an emotion largely backed up by the music on the record. Even the title itself seems to trend in this direction. The imagery called to mind by the title Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts is deeply haunting, leaving a feeling that this is the soundtrack to a devastated world. This is all hugely subjective, I really want to stress at this point, but I elaborate this to explain why of all M83's albums, this one feels so bleak to me. It's a fascinating tone for the project to strike out, and it definitely makes this album stand out in M83's discography as being something different, something special. M83's first album is an odd listen. While having several highlights on the track list, it's often quite challenging. It spends a fair amount of its runtime meandering through ideas, often not ones that ever seem to stick the landing. It often sounds like the duo aren't quite sure of themselves, throwing everything at the wall to see what works. More of that, however, it seems that the duo's vision often exceeds their limits, in that the production of the album vastly holds them back. The closing track, I'm Happy She Said, is a great example of this. Compositionally, it's quite beautiful, but the limited production of the album holds the crescendo back from the epic scale it reaches for. The reason I mention all this is that this is a problem that is largely remedied on Dead Cities. For a start, there's a much more intense focus on this album than there was on its direct predecessor. It seems on this record Gonzalez and Fromageau had a far better idea of what they wanted the album to sound like, and they largely stick to that sound. The result is an album that is far more consistent than their last, and as a result, an immediately more rewarding listen. It's also a faster one. Whereas their first album meanders along for about 70 minutes, this one clocks in at a sharper 57. This isn't to say M83 can't do longer albums. Most of their greatest works clock in at over an hour, but for a group still working on what exactly it is they were doing, the comparative brevity goes a long way in terms of making a statement. That they're here, and this is what they sound like. This sound is, of course, the perfect blend of electronica and shoegaze that this album strikes. Glitchy synths and overdriven, reverb-soaked guitars work hand in hand to build evocative soundscapes that hook the listener in and keep them captivated. These guitar-driven moments are certainly electric, from the energetic unrecorded to the monumental outro of Noise. But where this album stands apart is its ability to create the walls of sound characteristic to shoegaze, even without the use of guitars. In general, shoegaze is a genre defined by its use of overdriven, reverb-soaked guitars. I am aware that I've used that descriptor twice inside a minute, but it works, so unless I come up with a better one, it stays. But on this album, Gonzalez and Fromageau frequently replicate the shoegaze tone simply by piling several synths on top of one another to create massive walls of noise. Tracks such as Run Into Flowers don't have a guitar in sight, but still feel absolutely shoegaze in atmosphere. This innovation of sound not only marks this album as something unique, as some who first heard the album in 2003 state this was a sound that had never really been done before like this, but also lays the ground for M83's approach to the shoegaze genre in the future. The tactic of piles of synths to create walls of noise would be one that Gonzalez would remember and use to great effect, even on the immediately successive album Before the Dawn Heals Us. Now, the production of this album is still very rough. The polish that M83 would become known for wouldn't appear until Before the Dawn Heals Us. But unlike on the first album, this is less of a problem for the album and more of a feature. It seems that Gonzalez and Fromageau were more aware of the limitations they were playing in for their production, and instead played to push the limits of that limitation rather than attempt to exceed what they were capable of. The result is that rather than sound muddled like their first album, the production has a bite to it that M83 albums since have never been able to recapture. The album is raw with emotion, providing a fascinating energy to the album. An example of this that leaps to mind is the lead single from the album Run Into Flowers, which stands as one of my favorite tracks to ever come from M83. Compared to future tracks, the production is notably rough, but this aids in giving the track a unique atmosphere. The crash cymbals from the programmed drum machines blend into each other with every hit, becoming a layer of white noise that hangs precariously above the rest of the track. It's an eerie effect, but it's one that aids the melancholic nature of the track rather than hindering. Gone is another example. While the composition of the track already makes it a highlight on the track list, the more raw nature of the production provides it with an extra edge, making it one of the most emotionally tense tracks M83 has ever recorded. However, I think a massive credit to this album is how quickly it introduces this new and improved sound and demonstrates that this album is something different and something special. While the introducing track Birds is little more than a minute-long prelude, the second track Unrecorded explodes into view with a perfect blend of synthetic strings and overdriven guitars, pushing the album forward with an intense and infectious energy. It's a far more effective hook from the album than Night on the preceding album, and it perfectly introduces what's to come for this album. Look, I know I'm dunking on M83's first album a lot in this video, so I feel it's important for me to stress that I do like the album. It's just not especially the project's best work, and Dead Cities really does demonstrate that drastic an improvement. Something that also changed between the first album and Dead Cities was the scope that Gonzalez and Fromageau were composing for. Their first effort was comparatively low-key, largely taking on ambient tones for much of the proceedings. But on Dead Cities, something changed. The scope of the music was suddenly opened up, taking a more epic cinematic tone. This is admittedly harder to quantify into words, but Dead Cities is noticeably bigger than the self-titled debut, using an almost orchestral approach to the synths to build these huge tracks that could almost be film soundtracks. This scope is somewhat helped by the imagery invoked in the cover art and the album and track titles. The name Dead Cities, Red Seas and Lost Ghosts already conjures up some very strong images, but the music itself massively succeeds in that respect. Tracks like On a White Lake Near a Green Mountain and Gone are awash with layers of synths and strings, building them towards emotional highs that are far grander in scale than anything on the previous album. This marks a massive turning point for the project. M83 will of course become known for their epic sound that permeates through albums like Hurry Up We're Dreaming or Before the Dawn Heals Us, so to hear the beginnings of that on this album really is something special. In fact, I would go as far to say as it is almost more impressive here than it is later. The fact that Gonzalez and Fromageau were able to capture this epic scope through the far less polished production on this record is a testament to their talent indeed. Throughout this video, I've largely touched on the album as a whole and what makes it special as a unit, but I haven't talked enough, I feel, about some of the individual tracks on the album, something I feel is important for me to do to really capture how brilliant this album is. Several of the tracks on this album stand as my favorite M83 tracks this far, and one of them, from my interactions with the M83 fan group as a whole, is hailed as one of their finest moments, full stop. The album begins strongly, of course. The double act of Birds and Unrecorded, as mentioned earlier, perfectly set the stage for the album as a whole and mark the massive improvement that M83 has made between albums. But the next track, Run Into Flowers, kicks the album into third gear. The track announces itself quite dramatically with an explosive synth hook and cacophonous drum machines. But as more synths layer on top of each other, the track takes on a deeply melancholic tone, one aided by the introduction of a string section in the second half. None of the elements play the same part, all adding their own melodies to the track. It could have sounded messy, but they all mesh together perfectly, creating a sort of melancholy uneasiness. Aiding in this atmosphere is Gonzalez's M83 vocal debut, singing only "Give me peace and chemicals, I want to run into." It adds a layer of desperation to the track, giving it a deeply sad meaning. It stands to me as one of the most beautiful things M83 has ever recorded, and is a high point that for most would be very difficult to follow up. This makes the change in atmosphere for the next track even more intriguing. As Run Into Flowers fades out, a church organ fades in, ringing in the track in church. This is also a beautiful track, but it's a somewhat unsettling one too. The main organ part has an almost majestic sound to it, but when Gonzalez's vocals enter, they sound mournful, creating a sort of dissonance in the track. It's unsettling, but it goes a long way into building the bleak atmosphere of the album. It seems, however, to be more of a transitional piece, leading the album into America, a frantic track that abruptly cuts itself off to introduce my next highlight, the 1-2 punch of On a White Lake Near a Green Mountain and Noise. On its own, On a White Lake would be a vastly impressive track. The blend between electronic and shoegaze music through the lens of an almost orchestral composition is of course astonishing to listen to, as is the fact that this track is the first evidence of M83's coming taste for the epic and the cinematic. The relationship between the melancholic music and the seemingly peaceful track title alludes to something far sadder under the surface, as if something terribly tragic has happened on this white lake near a green mountain. All of this is brilliance in of itself, but then the music drops away to a single tone, a drone that is cut off with the introduction of noise. This is M83 at their most shoegaze, a track filled with dense guitar layering that is driven forward by a synth playing a simple 4-note hook. More and more guitars build up on top of one another, and slowly the track opens up, giving way to this cavernous reverb that absorbs all the detail in the composition and leaves the listener swimming, feeling almost lost in the noise. This track was a defining moment in my appreciation for shoegaze as a genre, and remains one of my favorite shoegaze tracks ever written. However, 3 tracks later we get my favorite on the album, and probably one of my favorite tracks M83 has ever recorded and probably will ever record. This track is, of course, the 6-minute long Gone, a melancholic masterpiece. The build-up of this track is of course perfect. Beginning with a drone from a synthetic string section, layers are methodically placed on top of one another to create a tragic atmosphere, a mournful lead synth, accompanying strings, and then rolls from drum machines that never feel intrusive. All of these elements work in tandem to create a palpable tension, one that threatens to break at any moment. And with a rising cymbal rush and a cathartic scream filtered through white noise, it does. The middle section of this track is M83 at their most furious. The sadness of this track is still present, but it's propelled forward with an emotion that, if I had to give it a name, would be rage. This rage is enhanced by the raw production of the album. I honestly believe if this track were to be recorded today with the polish that M83 has come to have, it would miss something vital to making it as intense as it is. Eventually, the rage gives out, and we are left with only the orchestral drone again to play us out and lead us into the comparatively delicate closer, Beauties Can Die. The track sounds almost tired, as if the explosion of emotion had been exhausting. As I mentioned earlier, it is an emotionally violent track, and I seem to remember its effect on me the first time I heard it as being utterly devastating. But it is also the most cathartic of M83's tracks. The fury of this middle section provides a release unlike anything else I have ever heard. It stands miles apart of anything else the band has ever done, and alone would have cemented this album in history. There is a lot that makes Dead Cities, Red Seas, and Lost Ghosts special. When I went to Reddit to ask fellow M83 fans how they feel about this album, I was presented with a lot of interesting answers. That it was a completely new sound to them back in 2003, that the themes of nature and the sound effects and track titles make for a fascinating energy on the album. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the 18-minute long title track that comes with vinyl editions of the album, an ambient piece that builds to a synth-laden climax that is remarkably cheerier than the rest of the album that it is attached to. And that doesn't even touch on the B-sides from this album's single releases, like the energetic God of Thunder. There is more even about this album that I love, but it becomes increasingly hard for me to express it verbally. For all the praise I can heap on this album, for all the explanations of the moving parts that make it special, I think you really have to listen to it to get the full scope of its place in music history. It has been 20 years since this album was released, but in that time its quality has not aged, has not diminished at all. It is still a monumental record, both in M83's discography and in electronic music in general, and is clearly the major stepping stone that was taken to give us the M83 that we know and love today.